Imagine a future where you no longer require petrol and other fossil fuels because all transport now levitates. Even though this future seems achievable to an average person, to most scientists, this future isn't just far-fetched, but downright impossible. Turns out, in order for it to be a reality, we'd need anti-gravity. Simply defined as a force that negates the effects of gravity, anti-gravity is largely believed to be a thing of science fiction or cartoon physics. That's not to say scientists haven't attempted to make it a reality. Throughout the late 90s, a physicist by the name of Ning Li published a series of rather controversial papers about the phenomenon. But just when people thought she was on the cusp of an anti-gravity breakthrough, Li dropped off the face of the Earth. Did the government have something to do with her disappearance? Did she uncover something sinister in her research? Let's find out the answers to these questions and more in today's video. Not much is known about Li's early life, except that she emigrated to the United States from China in 1983. Originally from Shandong, she graduated with a degree in physics from Peking University. After arriving in America, she took up employment at the Center for Space Plasma and Aeronomic Research at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. As per sources, she remained with the university until the year 2000, after which she left to start her own company. Before we can explain what this company specialized in, it's important to understand the nature of Li's research. As we hinted at before, she was a trailblazer in the field of anti-gravity. Together with her colleague Douglas Torr, she published a series of articles on the subject. The first of these articles was titled Effects of a Gravomagnetic Field on Pure Superconductors and was published in 1991. Then immediately after, in the years 1992 and 1993, the duo published two more articles. In the year 1997, the journal Physica C published an article titled Static Test for a Gravitational Force Coupled to Type II YBCO Superconductors. Li conducted the research for this article with a handful of employees from the NASA Marshall Space Flight Center. If it wasn't obvious enough from the titles, the research was mainly hinged on superconductors. Although we're certainly not expert physicists, we know for a fact that a superconductor is any material that can conduct electricity from one atom to another without experiencing resistance. At the simplest, there is no loss of energy from one point to another. If you're thinking what we're thinking, yes. These materials have the power to completely change how we utilize electricity. However, one thing to remember is that superconductivity can't be achieved at room temperature at this point in time. It requires the material to be cooled down to a temperature of 133 Kelvin, or minus 220 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's not all. The materials being used need to have specialized electronic and structural features as well. Now, some of you might bring up the time that scientists successfully experimented with a room temperature superconductor, referred to as a copper-substituted lead apatite. Let us remind you that while this material showcased signs of superconductivity, it was nowhere near substantial enough to consider. All we're saying is that superconductivity isn't a walk in the park, even for the greatest scientists out there. But none of these loopholes stopped Ning Li. Again, since we're scientifically challenged, here's a crux of Li's findings from Wikipedia. Li claimed that an anti-gravity effect could be produced by rotating ions, creating a gravitomagnetic field perpendicular to their spin axis. In her theory, if a large number of ions could be aligned in a Bose-Einstein condensate, the resulting effect would be a very strong gravitomagnetic field, producing a strong repulsive force. The alignment may be possible by trapping superconductor ions in a lattice structure in a high-temperature superconducting disk. Now, unlike most researchers and despite the many loopholes, Li wasn't simply shooting arrows in the dark. As a matter of fact, she went on to design a 12-inch prototype discs to support her findings. Jim Wilson, a contributor for the science and tech magazine Popular Mechanics, was invited to Li's laboratory in Huntsville, Alabama, to take a look at the disc. In his 2000 article on the prototype, Wilson clarified that while the machine may be capable of constructing a force that acts on matter like gravity, it wasn't exactly an anti-gravity machine, he said. Strictly speaking, it won't be an anti-gravity machine. but by exerting an attractive or repulsive force on all matter. It would be the functional equivalent of the impossible machine. This same article also revealed that Lee had left the university in the summer of 2000 to commercialize this device. What's more, it talked about how she was looking for several $1 million in funds to help support the making of her HTSD disc. As we mentioned earlier, she left the university to start her own company. This company was called AC Gravity, and at one point in time was located at 511 Sparkman Drive, Huntsville, Alabama. They even had an email address of lining@comcast.net. Now, even though some sources claim that the company went out of business in 2002, as far as we know, they continued to renew their license up until 2018. The company was, in fact, listed as an expectant business even in 2021. Whatever may be the case, there's no doubt that it thrived in its heyday. This would explain why Lee was shortly joined in this venture by the chair of the physics department at UAH, Larry Smalley. Her theory really must have been worthwhile. Think about it. Would she have received a grant of $448,000 from the US Department of Defense if her theory didn't have potential? Exactamundo. Surprisingly, despite securing this grant in 2001, Lee never published any of her results in 2002, like she was expected to. In fact, aside from a reference to her chairing a gravitational wave conference that took place in 2003.
Did you ever get a chance to read, and if so, do you have any thoughts on Ning Lee's 1993 paper on gravitroelectric coupling via superconductivity?
Well, I certainly read all of her papers. I also participated in the MITRE conference where she made a major presentation. And originally I thought, she may really be onto something. But the fact that it hasn't particularly gone anywhere.
After 2002, it seems she had stopped publishing altogether. If you know anything about the scientific world, you might know that if you don't publish, you're really likely to perish. As a result, by 2004, the once celebrated scientist had completely fallen off the radar. But was her inability to publish the thing to blame for her disappearance from the public eye? Or was something bigger at play? As opposed to what the world would have you believe, it's not uncommon for scientists who make grand discoveries to suddenly go radio silent. In 1996, for instance, Eugene Podkletnov, only a grad student back then, claimed that there was a way to negate the impact of gravity on objects by placing them on a superconducting disk. The said disk, which we could call a gravity shielding device as far as we've learned, had to be powered by powerful electromagnets. Initially, his research gained much traction, so much so that even NASA showed interest in it. However, within months, he withdrew his paper on the subject from a reputable physics journal. What's more, he also lost funding from the Finnish university that was supporting him, causing him to return to Russia. Even though the article being leaked to the press was cited as the major reason for its withdrawal at the time, some troubling information came to light a few years after this incident. Podkletnov revealed that a few scientists in Canada and Sheffield had stolen his idea. While their projects only turned out to be mere replications, Boeing, as per sources, was thinking of funding a full-fledged project to construct gravity shielding devices using rotating superconductors. This project was titled GRASP, Gravity Research for Advanced Space Propulsion, but upon questioning, Boeing denied its existence. However, if there's anything we've learned over the years, it's that there's nothing powerful companies won't do to hide their technology. Now, to return to Lee's case, could similar things have happened to her as well? Did someone steal her findings before she could publish them? Well, here's where things get interesting. Eugene and Ning Lee's stories intersect. Turns out that in 2004, just as Lee's trail was starting to go cold, a journalist by the name of Tim Ventura reached out to Podkletnov. He told him that he was trying to track down Dr. Ning Lee and receive the lingning@comcast.net address from before in response. Sadly, even though all of this mail to the address was being read, he couldn't get a response. Frustrated, he reached out to the Russian scientist again. At this point, Podkletnov assured him that Lee was well and still employed with the DoD. As a result, she couldn't speak freely about her work. To boot, Eugene failed to get Ventura a working email or phone number from the researcher. From this point forward, Ning Li's figure became even more shrouded in mystery. Nobody knew where she was until July of 2008. A scientist named Jack Sarfati blew her cover. As per Sarfati's video interview on YouTube, Lee left her position with the DoD to return to China. And that's not all. He also accused her of helping the Chinese government to be the first to develop anti-gravity propulsion technology. In this video, he also made claims about how even the Pentagon couldn't get a hold of her. Here's part of what he said. She, Lee, is allegedly back in China, and the Chinese are pouring money into similar experiments now. That's why our intelligence guys are very interested. The most likely people to develop the first anti-gravity propulsion technology are the Chinese.
One of the key scientists in this electrogravitic superconductivity sort of stuff is a Chinese woman named Ning Li. And she has disappeared, allegedly going back to China. And our intelligence agencies do have very good
Wasn't she
information.
working at NASA?
She was working at NASA,
Yeah.
Richardson Arsenal, and but she disappeared for several years. The people at the Pentagon who were in touch with her cannot reach her anymore. She is allegedly back in China, and the Chinese, Red Chinese, are putting a lot of money into these exotic projects.
Now, it doesn't take a genius to guess that the conspiracies only multiplied after the Chinese government entered the equation. They don't have the best reputation when it comes to transparency. This might explain why people refused to believe that Lee had died after her obituary started doing rounds in 2021. Posted by the Berry Hill Funeral Home in Alabama, it read that the doctor who'd invented the world's first 12 HTSD in the late 90s had peacefully passed away on July 27th. It also mentioned that she'd been survived by a son named George Men, as well as her grandchildren, Vivian Ying Ying Men and Andy Yang Yang Men. In case you didn't notice, the obituary points to the fact that her funeral took place in Alabama, meaning that she never left for China. But as we said, people weren't ready to take it at face value. However, things drastically changed after Noah Logan, a staff writer at the Huntsville Business Journal, got interested in the case. After watching a video such as this on Ning Li's findings, Noah decided that it was time to solve the mystery of the missing scientist once and for all. Now, believe it or not, it was the contested obituary that came in handy. After days of research, Noah was finally able to locate her son, George, via a number associated with his business. After the two got to know each other, Noah was then invited to his house to uncover the mystery of his mother. Speaking of which, George revealed that although nobody had given him a call, he'd received several letters from as far as New Zealand, asking about his mother's research. In an article that he published about their meeting, Noah recalls that George had joked about how his mother had even dismissed his efforts to get to know more about her work. Here's how the article reports on what went down. I asked her once, he, George, recalled. I said, "Mom, do you need to tell me something?" She, Lee, told me, "First off, you don't know anything. Second off, if you even think you might know something, you forget about it." I said, "Okay, that's fine." Interestingly enough, even though his mother's research is counted among some of the world's biggest unsolved mysteries, George wasn't aware of this. In fact, Noah had to give him a quick rundown of all the speculation surrounding Ning Li. From this discussion, Noah discovered that Sarfati's claims from 2008 couldn't have been more untrue. Not only had Lee stayed on in America, when the Chinese Communist Party offered her to come to work with them in 2008, Lee declined the offer as well. George disclosed that since she'd first moved with him to the States, his maternal grandmother's funeral was the only time his mother had attempted to go back to China. Sadly, she didn't get permission, and as George remembers, this made her very upset. Among other things, George also talked about how leaving the university for the public sector changed his mother for the worse. Now, we're sure we don't need to explain how a position with the DoD comes with the burden of keeping everything top secret. According to George's account, this secrecy took a toll on his mother. Unlike her time at the university, where she'd made somewhat of a track record by publishing one article after the other, she'd come home from her job with the DoD completely worn out. He also mentioned how his mother had become quieter after quitting her job at UAH. He said she would return from work looking worn down with her makeup messed up. It wasn't like that when she was at the university. If you need more evidence as to how much the government values its privacy, through the Freedom of Information Act, Noah requested for Ning Li's 2001 findings to be released to the world at large. Unfortunately, and even though there were a plethora of similar ones, his request was denied. Nonetheless, aside from how secretive she was about her role at the DoD, George recounted a few fond memories of his mother as well. For instance, he told Noah that the doctor was very single-minded. She'd concentrate on only one thing at a time and had passed this habit down to her children as well. He also added that she'd always told him to make the most of his passion and not to compare himself to others. In his article, Noah mentioned how George wanted his kids to learn from their grandmother. Moving on, he told Noah how a few events in 2014 turned his family's life on its head. Turns out, while on her way back from work one day, Dr. Ning Li was hit by a vehicle. To make matters worse, his father, who'd witnessed his wife fall from the impact, suffered a heart attack. A year later, in 2015, he passed away. Li, one of her generation's smartest minds, meanwhile survived the event only to be diagnosed with permanent brain damage. She was only 46 at the time. Anyway, after the accident, George took care of his mother until she passed away in 2021. That obituary, therefore, wasn't part of some big conspiracy as people had assumed for years. In Noah's article, George was quoted as saying that seeing his mother suffer from Alzheimer's for 6 years before her death was quite challenging. As someone who'd made a name off of her intelligence alone, it's not difficult to see where he might have been coming from. Nonetheless, when people would ask him about how he'd managed to do it for all those years, he remembered that he only had positive things to say. For example, he was thankful for Dr. Li for giving him a better life. He mentioned to Noah that were it not for his mother, he would never have been able to come to the US and get his education. Finally, he revealed that he was really proud of his mother. At the conclusion of Noah's article, we're also told that even though she couldn't speak, the doctor was uncomfortable during her final years as well. In moments where George could pick up on her discomfort, he recalls playing Buddhist-inspired music to help her relax. When he discovered that it didn't work, George, who himself found comfort in the Christian church, decided to give Christian hymns a go. He told Noah how these hymns would usually help change her mood for the better. We don't know about you, but we think there's a lesson in here somewhere for people who think that science and faith are always at odds with each other. While on the subject of lessons, we think the story also teaches us that sometimes there's more to conspiracies than hoverboards and UFOs. As a matter of fact, if people had gone through the trouble of doing a little more research on Li's papers, they'd know that other scientists had poked holes in her theory as early as 1994. For example, a year after she published her third paper on anti-gravity, Mark Kowit of BDM Federal Inc. dismissed her findings for being overestimated. In one of his research articles titled Gravitomagnetism and Magnetic Permeability in Superconductors, he critiqued Tor and Li's work for misunderstanding something called magnetic permeability. What's more, he concluded that the duo had proposed flawed models of the superconductor's microdynamics to support their trumped-up estimates. Nevertheless, this doesn't take away from the fact that Ning Li was brilliant in her field of study, and that tinfoil hatters may owe her an apology for reducing her life's work to a conspiracy theory. But we don't want to get your hopes down yet, because while previously anti-gravity was the holy grail of science, researchers are starting to take the subject more seriously. Take Eugene Podkletnov as an example. As per a Medium article published by Tim Ventura, he's going to take up his research involving the gravity shielding disk from 30 years ago all over again. Of course, he's no longer calling it that. But what's interesting is that since he's an advocate of scientific research being conducted out in the open, we've more chances of finding out how gravity is modified, if not negated. All in all, if we were you, we wouldn't stop looking forward to those hoverboards anytime soon.